This video looks at the Moodle Output functionality covering the output, page and navigation APIs, including renderers and templates. Does not include any theme-related stuff, which is not covered in the course anyway. The content of this presentation is actually taken from different parts of two of the lessons in the course. The content of this video has been extracted from the Moodle plugin development by example course from Moodle Publishing. But before we start, if this video proves to be useful and informative, please don't forget to like it. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel for more useful content in the future. If you are so inclined, click the bell notification to be informed when we upload new content. So we'll start with the Output API. So this API handles most of Moodle's output. It provides generic functions and additional components, JavaScript output, renderers, and templates fall under this API. Okay. There's several files in Moodle's lib folder to do with output, but the ones that are of note are the output components PHP, which defines HTML element classes and also defines the global output methods and includes the HTML_writer class, and we'll see those a little later on. It has the weblib.php, which is a library of functions for output, web output, and some old general purpose Moodle PHP functions to do with producing HTML output. Then we've got output renderers. So this is the class for rendering HTML, and it includes the renderer base class, which is available via the output global. And output renderers then develops into renderers and templates, which we'll talk about a little later on. Okay. So the output components PHP defines a number of interfaces representing HTML elements, and which are extensively used by the output methods. So generally, you implement interfaces renderable and templable when you're working with this file. So we have a number of general functions, for example, things to work with pictures and icons, so you can get the user picture, get help icons, etc. HTML bar classes, so progress bar, paging bar, etc. Tab classes, tab tree and tab object, and other classes for blocks, action menus, preferences, and all that other kind of stuff. Form related classes, we've got file picker, which we will discuss again later. It will come up again. There's a massive overlap with File API and Form API with File Picker. There's the single button, which is simply gives you a single button process instead of defining a whole form just to have a single button on it. You can generate a single button, a single select, and a URL select, which is a URL selection widget. There are other classes, the JS writer for writing out JavaScript, and methods include the function call, initializing the objects, etc. The HTML writer, which is used quite extensively when you just want to write little snippets of HTML. And defining a renderer or a template would be a bit of overkill. So we've got those ones, and that's been in Moodle for a long time. Very useful class. The HTML table, which is actually kind of part of that HTML writer, holds information required to render HTML table. And then connected to that as well is the table cell, which represents a table cell, and the table row represents a table row. And it's a really quite flexible. You can have the table row defined as an array of HTML table cells, or just simply an array of strings. So it's quite useful when generating HTML. But now I think the thinking is mainly about using renderers and using templates when talking about content, especially if you're generating quite a bit of content. So the weblib PHP defines several classes such as progress trace and the Moodle_URL class, which is very useful when it comes to working with Moodle URLs and getting the right URL in the right format for the HTML you are generating. Right, continuing some general functions. S, which adds quotes to HTML characters. P, that prints quotes to HTML characters. I suspect one returns and the other one echoes straight away. I've really had to use those. I don't think I've ever used them actually, but there's a case for using them. Format text, which is when given text, it ensures the text is safe HTML. Clean text takes raw text, removes any nasties out of it. Get local referrer. If you're trying to get the referrer, you've got several options there as to how you require the referrer to be returned. Okay. HTML to text, so take some HTML and convert it to text, so kind of like strip tags. And to check if the site is running under SSL, you've got your function is HTTPS. Some more other ones is in pop-up and close window. Me, to return the name of the current script, and qualified me, which tries to give you the full URL for the current script. Notice prints out a message and exits, so a nice little text box or whatever HTML box on the page. Redirect is to redirect the user to another page, so you'd normally use that with your Moodle _URL to get the right URL to be sending the user to, and optionally you can get it to print a notice in the redirect. Okay. Strip links will strip all the links. Text to HTML takes normal text and turns it into HTML. And validate email to validate an email address. So there's a couple of links to help you look through the Output API, and it's useful to have a look at the documentation anyway, because there's only so much I can tell you in a course. Okay, so now what we're going to do is have a look at the renderers and templates, which is part of the Output API functionality. So when a plugin needs to display output, HTML output, the recommended method right now is to use renderers. So if you're doing a whole page with lots of stuff on it, etc., the best way of doing that is using output renderers. Now, renderers were introduced in Moodle 2.0, and that introduced the global output object, which really points to Moodle's core renderer. It can be used for other non-display content generation, such as emails and data exports. They may also use templates, and now currently this shift is to using renderers and templates to generate outputs. So templates are no logic in them, they're just basically a template of HTML that is used to generate output, and we'll talk about that a little later on. It is worth noting that theme designers can define renderers and templates, and as well override plugin renderers. So a theme might want to display things in a different way to what you envisage happening with your plugin's output. So Moodle 2.9 actually introduced the concept of templates. So prior it was you had your renderers and you generated your content in your renderers. But now the idea is that you use templates via your renderer, you call the templates, and use templates. So the templates are written in Mustache, and there's a link there to the Mustache template, which is a logicless templating system. Templates should be saved in the plugin's templates folder and must have a .mustache extension. So renderers would use templates by calling the method render from template method in the form like what is on the screen right now. So you'd call your template name and pass the data. Now this data is not your form data, as we always kind of tend to call data that's submitted. This is the data as in reference to the Mustache's documentation, the data to be used by the template. So a kind of holder of all the data that the template will need to actually render itself. Okay, and you can look at the Moodle documentation at the link there to see how and where and coding styles to be used, etc., etc. We're not going to be covering templates in this course in any much further detail, but it's worth having a look at that, especially if we are creating a plugin that does a lot of output. So going back to renderers, Renderers are normally defined in the renderer.php files. Generally up to Moodle 2.8 that was in the plugins folder, but since 2.8 it's defined in the classes subdirectory and can follow Moodle's auto-loading rules if you're following Moodle's auto-loading rules. So your renderer can be defined in the classes folder. The renderer class normally will be extending the base core renderer base class, and code in the renderer should not refer to any of the two globals, $page, which we'll be talking about a little later on, and the $output variable, but can access the core functionality of those two globals via this variable in the class. Okay, the renderer is obtained by calling the global page get renderer method, and there is a sort of unwritten rule, it's a kind of convention to name the renderer variable that you get back from get renderer in lowercase output to show its relation to the global uppercase output. And so that's a kind of overview of renderers. Now we mentioned the global page variable, so what we're going to do is have a look at the page API as well now. So you can think of the global variable $page as a sort of container for the page content, which is usually HTML. So it's like the scaffolding around the actual content for the page. So the variable is an instance of the Moodle underscore page class, which is defined in the pagelib.php file in the lib folder, and it is created very early in the request cycle in setup PHP. It includes all kinds of information like the theme and the layout, the JavaScript and the CSS requirements, titles, headings, navigation, blocks to display. In other words, like I said earlier, it's a kind of scaffolding that kind of contains, or the container that contains all the actual output, the stuff that you need to generate output. Okay, the page URL and the context are always required to, and these are properties of that page global. So when you come into displays, so this is now relevant to us going back to our index PHP. We have to set up our page before we actually start to generate content. So there's things that you need to do is like set the page URL. Like I said, that's required, and so you usually pass some kind of Moodle URL object to the function. Then there's a context, so the context sets the context of the actual page, and this then determines what gets shown through the navigation API, etc. So there are some methods like set course and set CM, which will automatically set the context for you if you use those. Okay, the page layout method, I'm not quite sure what happens if you don't define it. I think it just uses the default page layout or the standard page layout, but you can set the page layout for the page. You then set the page's title. That's the title that will appear in the title tags, and the heading, which sets the heading for the page, and that is theme dependent. Some themes don't actually display the headings as such. So you can get page information from the page variable, so you can find out what course you're on if you are in a course. So page course, page CM if you're in a course module. You can get the title. Useful one is page the header printed. So this will determine if the header has already been printed, which you would want to know before you try and send, let's say, a file, the contents of a file, etc. Okay, and then you can actually get access to your navigation. The navigation API allows for the manipulation of the site's navigation. The user interface interpretation of the navigation is what the user sees, so it's contextually based on the location of the user in the system and is normally displayed via navigation and settings blocks. There are three ways to work with the navigation: using the plugin settings.php file, which is usually for navigation options that are always available, but particularly for navigation in the site administration area of the site. The global admin is an instance of the admin root class defined in admin lib lib.php in the lib folder, and it's the root of all the navigation nodes available. Okay. The second way to do it is dynamically during code execution, though you don't really call the global page object until it's defined, because that's where you would get the navigation objects from. Okay. And then the third way is via callbacks that are built into Moodle, where the core makes specific calls to plugins, normally via the lib.php file, to allow the component to make changes to the navigation tree. There are two extra special cases. So you've got, for all plugins, a way to do it, but they are on top of that. Modules and local plugins have additional ways of plugging into the navigation. So access to navigation objects is gained via the global page variable. Okay. And then you've got the three settings. You've got the navigation, which is the main navigations, the settings nav, which is the settings navigation, and the navbar, which is specifically the breadcrumb navigation. All these three navigation objects are extensions of the navigation_node class, and that's defined in the navigation lib.php in the lib folder, which implements a renderable interface, which means user interface. Okay. So each item added to the navigation is a node object for various types, and obviously it's organized in a tree structure of root, parent, child. So there are many ways the navigation API gives you a way to work with the navigation. So some useful methods are things like find and get, to find particular navigation nodes, add nodes and create, to add nodes to the navigation tree, and then you can find information about a node by having a look to see whether it's got siblings or children, and getting the siblings, etc. So there are two node types, and they're defined as constants: the node type _leaf, which is an end node, and the branch, which is the container for the leaves. Each node type has its types, so I call them node types. And these are specific class extensions for specific types of nodes, and they will have their specific functionality for what's their speciality as such. So you've got all those on the screen there, things like category, course, container, user, custom, etc., etc. So the callbacks, the third way of plugging into the navigation lib via your lib.php file. Callbacks are basically your component name _extend _ and then your whatever navigation we are extending. So for example, in a course, your plugin might get a call to extend the course navigation, and those are the functions there that detail the different navigation areas. So in category settings, in the front page, the navigation for the user, are all bits that plugins can modify the navigation if it's so required. Activity modules and local plugins, as I mentioned, have additionally two special callbacks for them. Okay, and modules is specifically for dealing with module navigations. So the module callbacks are when the user is viewing a page within a module and should only extend that navigation for that module. So the functions are module name, which is basically your Frankenstein name without the mod _, extend navigation, and extend settings navigation set functions there, as you can see on the screen. Local callbacks are similar, but local callbacks gives you the opportunity to extend the global navigation and the global settings navigation, but with those two functions that you need to define in your lib.php file. So for more information about the navigation API, there's a link there for you to follow. So that's it for the presentation. To watch other extracts from the course, click on the playlist link, or alternatively, watch the video describing the course content. Don't forget to subscribe and like, and thanks for watching.